All right, before we get to the next example, we're going to kind of explain a few ways to prove that triangles are congruent. So now we've talked about triangles that are congruent. We know have 3 sides that are congruent and 3 angles that are congruent. But there are a few shortcuts. Sorry, guys, let me grab a drink of water here. We've been making videos all day and my throat keeps getting dry. So if we know there's 5 basically shortcuts that we can say. If we know that all 3 sides are congruent, side, 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 then we can say the triangles are congruent. So in order for this to work, we need to know that all 3 sides are congruent to 3 sides of another triangle. All right, so we don't even have to know anything about the angles. If you know all 3 sides are congruent, then you can say these 2 triangles are indeed congruent. Okay, there are 4 other ways. So this was kind of I think that one's the easiest. It's always the first one. This next one is side, angle, side. If you know 2 sides, so notice the sides right there. Now the angle has to be what they call the included angle. It has to be in between those 2 sides that you know. Okay, so it cannot be an angle that's over here. Do not let it be that angle over there. That it spells a bad word if you do that, and it's not congruent. There's actually 2 different triangles that you can draw if you know sides and an angle that's not included. So please note the only way this works is if that angle right there is in between the 2 sides. All right, now the next 2, if you know 2 angles in a side, basically they're congruent, but you've got to be able to differentiate. So we've got an angle side angle. So let's do these 2 angles. Maybe we know that those 2 angles are congruent. Angle side angle, notice that side again has got to be included. So it's got to be the side that's in between those 2 angles. That's what they consider angle side angle. Okay, so if it were a side that's not in between those 2 angles, so say it was this side over here, let's see, that was going to be our angle side, angle side. So it says 2 angles and a side opposite them. So the side not in between them, opposite one of those. Okay, and then our last one, it looks like there's only 2 bits of information on this one, but there really is 3 of this one as well. The hypotenuse leg, it has to have right angles in them. So you've got that those angles are congruent. So if you've got right angles and the hypotenuse in a leg, so if you've got the hypotenuse there's across from your right angle and any other side, so if you know that those 2 sides are congruent, then you can use this shortcut, the hypotenuse leg. All right, now before we go into the other example, most of the time they're not going to actually just draw triangles like this. They're going to actually make you work for it. So they're going to, so basically they'll draw you a picture. Sometimes they'll give you bits of information. They can either tell it to you in words or they can show it to you with the tick marks on the lines. But they can tell you that sides are congruent. However, sometimes they will just give you a midpoint. Now, you know, though, that the definition of a midpoint is that 2 sides are congruent. So if they tell you midpoint, they're really telling you 2 congruent sides. Please just note that. And this is my favorite reason that sides are congruent. I told you would get into this. You guys kind of laughed when we did the reflexive property earlier. But a side is congruent to itself. Okay, a side is congruent to itself. Now, sometimes you're going to have triangles that share a side. Okay, so if they both have the same base or if they both have the same right side, then that side is congruent to itself. So we could say that those triangles are congruent. Okay, now those are reasons that sides are congruent. Now we're going to go on to reasons that angles are congruent. Again, sometimes it's given. Sometimes they'll write it out in words and letters. Sometimes they'll just mark it on the picture. But if they tell you that they're congruent, they're congruent. Now, please also remember, though, that vertical angles are congruent. You've got a vertical angle theorem that says vertical angles are congruent. They're not going to mark those for you. You just have to know that. You're also going to be using, these 3 are going to be using parallel lines. If they tell you parallel lines, they are really not telling you anything about the sides of a triangle. They are telling you about angles. So just remember parallel lines from our last unit. If you have parallel lines that are congruent, Then the alternate interior angles are congruent, alternate exterior angles are congruent, and the corresponding angles are congruent. We don't care about the interior consecutive ones because they're not congruent. They're supplementary. We don't even care about them anymore. Okay, and then the last one, sometimes they'll tell you that an angle is being bisected. Okay, so please note that also tells you two congruent angles right there.